carries on this way, I won't be campaigning for him in 2018. So, but let us start with an overview. More people coming in. Do sit down. We're just about to start. Please find a seat, even if you have to go to the middle of rows. I can see some seats in the middle of rows. My goodness, nobody wants to hold the middle ground and sit in the middle. You're all sitting on the edges. Very interesting. Right. Did you all have a good Christmas break, New Year, and manage to get some rest? Did you? Yeah? Don't all shout at once, for you. Good God. Right. Okay, so we're going to start with Patrick Smith. And Patrick Smith, of course, some of you all know, editor of Africa Confidential, editor of the Africa Report, and he, of course, is privy to all sorts of information that he sometimes lets us know and sometimes doesn't let us know. Isn't that right, Patrick? But you're going to share your... sometimes you just make it up, no, not really. You're going to share your expansive thoughts with us by giving us an overview of the continent and what we can expect. So please do make your way to the lectern. Thank you. You don't need to clap.
Good. That saves the embarrassment. Bonne année, Happy New Year, and I hope it certainly won't be a bad one for journalists in terms of the action-packed year we're heading for. I wanted to start just by mentioning a few words and terms I think we're going to be hearing a lot of, and it might prove a sort of guide to some of the things that are going on this year. The first one actually was prompted just now, fake news, or as it used to be known, propaganda, post-truth, populism, nationalism, isolationism, authoritarianism, autocrat, end of the liberal order, alt-right, ultra-right, walls as in we'll build it, trade wars, Brexit, European partnership agreements, grand corruption, illicit financial flows, Russia, nuclear, hackers, Trumplandia, Trumpismo, and transition. So before the big transition that Zeinab referred to in Washington, there's two African transitions already, and I wanted to start there. The first one's already happened. I was there last weekend. It happened in Ghana. And I think as we're trying to sort of eke out some of the unambiguously good news of 2016 and that will fold into 2017. I think Ghana's probably a good place to start. There was a stunning election, as you all know. Stunning, not in terms of the result, but stunning in the way it was held and the way the parties conducted themselves, and the use of technology and the use of good, well-organized parties, structures that delivered the result that the opposition wanted, and the people of Ghana by almost a million votes. And I think it's significant both in the way that they organized themselves, got that result, and in the, as it was described, elegant way that the defeated president, John Mahama, said, well, game's up, over, I'm checking out. And so the transition, which has been going on for the last month, reached its conclusion on Saturday with the inauguration of Akufo-Addo. And now the reality kicks in, which is the economic inheritance of, I mean, Razia will get into the nitty-gritty, but it's a lot of debt and a stuttering economy, but with some more oil and gas on the horizon. Thanks to Trumplandia, the gold price is up with all that uncertainty and madness, so that could be good for Ghana as well. But I think it's going to be, the nature of that transition is going to have a resonance across the region, in other countries that are facing tough elections, and right the other side of Africa, in Kenya, for example, because I think it sends a message to the opposition in Kenya, if they seriously want to challenge Uhuru and Ruto in the Jubilee coalition in August, in the national elections in August, they're going to have to be far better organized, they're going to be far more coherent, and they have to decide very quickly who is the presidential candidate, and they're going to have that organization at grassroots level, and they're going to have to do what the opposition did in Ghana, which is to have a very energetic campaign in the courts to get the disclosure of all the election results at the polling booths and at the constituency centres, and all that work that the opposition did in Ghana to hold the Electoral Commission to account and ensure that they got their victory. Signs of that happening in Kenya are not too clear at the moment, so I think there's a bit of a question mark over that. The other transition this month is meant to happen on the 19th of January. And actually today, President Jammeh has come out with this statement that he, just like ECOWAS has a mediator in the shape of the Nigerian head of state, General Buhari, he is going to have his own national mediator to sort out the crisis he's caused by conceding defeat, then changing his mind and saying the election was a fix and demanding a rerun. So that's where we are in Gambia. So with Jammeh having his own national coordinator and Buhari and the others due to go to Banjul on Friday to try to urge him to accept the result that he did accept initially and check out on the 19th. The fear is that if he doesn't do that, things could get pretty ugly. It seems that from what is said today in this speech to the nation, he anticipates dragging the whole thing out to May when he can wait for the new Supreme Court to be installed and for that to rule on, and then he can hang on till then. And it's just a way really of kicking the can down the road. It does seem this time Senegal and Nigeria in particular have really got the bit in between their teeth, and they're desperately keen to get him out. I mean, his tenure in Gambia doesn't need a lot of analysis, I think. I guess everyone's got their views on it. It hasn't been another transition that has been extended over many years. Well, it could be extended over many years if President Joseph Kabila has his way, is checking out of power in Kinshasa. So far, so good. The Catholic Church has mediated in that, and everyone but Joseph Kabila has signed a deal which would mean that elections are going to be organized by the end of this coming year. That's a year later than the original calendar, and he will go at that stage, and he is meant to have undertaken not to try to change the constitution, extend his tenure, and so on. So for now, that seems to have dissipated the furore around his hanging on and dampened down the anger on the streets. But if he doesn't appear in public and sign the deal in public, there's a real fear that it could return to the high-tension confrontations we saw earlier last year, which resulted in 30 or 40 people being killed by security forces and so on, and a real campaign on the streets right across the country. Whatever happens, it seems that Etienne Tshisekedi, the sort of long-term opposition leader, and Moise Katumbi, the former governor of Katanga, are likely to put their hat into the ring as opposition candidates in the coming elections. Somalia, again, a sort of transition without a transition. A long process of indirect elections now means there's a parliament in place ready to elect a president. It's an indirect election of the president. The betting is that Hassan Sheikh Mohamud would actually continue. He's the known quantity. The concerns about security are going to continue there. The other big election this month is the African Union election in Addis Ababa at the annual meeting, where Abdoulaye, Senegalese human rights lawyer and activist Abdoulaye Bati is putting up to chair the chairmanship of the commission. He faces Kenya's Amina Mohamed and Botswana's Pelonomi Moitoi. All three are competing with a Chadian and an Equatorial Guinea candidate, competing to replace the incumbent, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, who's going back to South Africa, as many of you know, to try to be president of South Africa. But that election is extremely important, partly because it could influence very much the power of the African Union, how much the African Union is going to get engaged in situations like the Congo, and of course the situation in the two Sudans, but most pressingly the situation now in South Sudan, where several outside independent bodies have flagged the risk of mass ethnic-based killings restarting, and a concern that the terrible fissures that opened up, well, since December 2013 between Riek Machar supporters and Salva Kiir supporters are far from being healed and could flare up again. At the same time, 3.5 million people are in dire straits in terms of food and medicines at the moment. So that requires both engagement from the African Union and from the new head of the UN, Guterres, who has fortunately mentioned that. Another African Union connected issue is Morocco, which has been outside the African Union after the African Union recognized the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic like 20, 30 years ago. Morocco is now trying to get back into the African Union, and it's trying to court the new order in the African Union. So it's going to be very important, very interesting to see how it does that. South Africa is very much against recognizing Morocco's presence in the Western Sahara, and still regards it as the occupying force, as do several other countries in Africa, including Ghana. As for Nigeria, I think a lot of the news in Nigeria, well, it's going to be a mixture of the dire economic circumstances, which Razio will go into, but also exacerbated by some of the political crisis going on. Buhari started the year with a message to the Niger Delta, along the lines of, we're willing to engage with you and talk seriously. A lot of people saying it's very interesting that he's prepared to engage with the Niger Delta, which is sitting on 2.5 million barrels of oil a day, but less willing to engage with other dissident groups, whether they're in southeast Nigeria, the Biafra independence groups, or the groups in the Middle Belt, the Shias, Shia movement in Kaduna, and so forth. So there's a real pressure on Buhari to take a more political approach to some of the other security crises, the multifold security crises he faces. The other part of his job that is becoming quite difficult as well is managing his own party, the All Progressives Congress. There are two rogue leaders in that group. The Bola Tinubu, the former Lagos governor, and Atiku Abubakar, the former vice president, both of whom have their own sort of political agendas. It is said, well, it's a fact. Atiku Abubakar is going around hiring lobbyists for his presidential run in 2020. Bola Tinubu seems to be on very good speaking terms with him. And between them, both of them billionaires, so they've certainly got the wherewithal to make a run for the presidency. That old chestnut Zimbabwe and the delayed departure of the president. I think we're going to hear it again. Or more like the immovable object that's going to be eventually end up succeeding Mugabe. Under what circumstances, no one knows. Of course, any supporters of G40 and the First Lady would rubbish that immediately, but I think that is certainly the perception, most people, including our correspondents there. I Angola, I think very important to watch. Angola in August, after the elections, President Dos Santos has said he's going to hand over to João Lourenço. This is rather a modest departure after 40 years on the seat, but very, very significant. Lourenço is being touted as a modernist, reforming type leader who could finally galvanize Angola's great human capital and natural wealth and really start to shift the country in a more positive direction. I think that's tremendously important. Liberia, another election which could be a sort of a touch wood, a sort of Ghana Mark II. The president definitely wants to go. She's not at all ambiguous about that. She wants a good, peaceful election. She has actually chosen her successor, but the people are going to have the last vote on that. But she's backing her current vice president. But I think that's one to watch. And then we were just chatting now, two other places I would say do keep your eye on this year. Ethiopia, just in terms of the whole authoritarian development model that Ethiopia has been pursuing, that is really at risk now, those economic gains. Whatever you think of the politics, you've got to accept there have been some serious economic gains over the last 10, 20 years. That is now at risk from a number of political factors that have welled up. Not least, as Razia pointed out just now, the fact that the diaspora's engagement has been partly responsible for that economic uplift in terms of supporting it and coming back and working with them. Now they want the political progress and the political liberalization. They're not getting it. So there's a real tension between those two forces. And Mozambique, 5 years ago, the great star that had discovered the natural gas. Then we discovered that a couple of banks, Credit Suisse and Russia's VTB, had got together with Gubuza, lent $2 billion secretly, and had sunk the economy in the process. Now we face court hearings. Mozambique is mired in debt, and it has to be settled. But another important issue to watch in the coming year. Thanks for your attention.
As always, Patrick, thank you very much, a tour de force. When you got to Zimbabwe, I thought, we've got to Z. He's finishing now because you're over time. Then you went back to the beginning of the alphabet with A for Angola. And I thought,
no logic at all.
We're going to be here all night. Thank you very much indeed. Razia Khan is our next speaker, although you already told us what she was going to say, but she hasn't even spoken yet. But anyway, Razia Khan, of course, is a very well-known and respected market analyst. She's at Standard Chartered, where she's one of the chief advisors on Africa. And Razia, you were also before on the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Development and Poverty. And you are also a council member of the Royal African Society. And we are always very grateful for your help and advice. So you're going to give us a view. You're sitting next to me, aren't you? We're going to keep it cozy now. But you're going to talk to us about the economic outlook.
Thank you, Zainab. So the big challenge, what does Africa's economy, all those different countries, look like in 2017? Maybe we should start with a recap of 2016, when there's a lot of soul-searching. Was there anything to the Africa Rising story? Suddenly, sub-Saharan Africa was a region that was associated with weaker growth. And how much was it really fair to think that all of that growth experience didn't really count for very much, that Africa had hit the cyclical headwinds, the outlook was going to be different? A few points do need to be explained. In 2016, the sub-Saharan African region likely saw the weakest growth that it had seen in average terms since the global financial crisis. Now that meant a very significant loss of momentum. But we also know that because the two largest economies, Nigeria and South Africa, between them account for about 50% of GDP, if you're looking at any average for the region, those countries are going to punch above their weight. And what we did see in 2016, it will likely be confirmed, an outright contraction in the Nigerian economy, we think of around 1.7%, and of course very minimal growth, quite close to zero, in South Africa. But that did not mean that the rest of Africa was not growing. A lot of countries in East Africa still managing to post growth rates of between 5 to 6%, not a bad experience at all. Even in the face of lower commodity prices, that came as a boost to some economies. In Francophone Africa, Côte d'Ivoire, everyone's looking very carefully at prospects given events of the last weekend, but that has been one of the star performers recently. Growth of around 10.3% in 2015, likely to sustain around 7 to 8% growth in the medium term. And oil importers like Senegal managing to grow at the fastest rate that we've seen for about 13 years. So a lot of you have gathered here this evening and only to hear the news that Africa isn't a single country. Don't pay too much attention to those regional averages that are weighted by GDP, so the bigger economies have a disproportionate influence. But if anything, that should give us a little bit of hope that we will see a cyclical turnaround in 2017. Why is this? What actually drove the contraction of the Nigerian economy in 2016? We saw these large double-digit falls in the oil sector growth in the second and third quarter of the year. Sure, the rest of the economy, the non-oil sector, which makes up about 92% of GDP, wasn't doing very well, and prospects there still look a little uncertain. But mathematically, with higher oil prices, it's going to be very difficult for Nigeria to deliver another contraction of the magnitude that we saw last year. So even if not very much changes, you would expect to see maybe this move into positive territory in 2017. Of course, the hope for Nigeria must be that it can do better than that. This was an economy that not so long ago was growing at around 6 to 7%. What needs to change? The fault is not so much what had happened globally with oil prices. A lot of it has to do with domestic policy decisions. When oil prices collapsed at the end of 2014, the decision was taken in early 2015 to freeze the currency. To try to put this in layperson's terms, what this meant was that the Nigerian economy had seen this massive external shock. And instead of allowing something that isn't very meaningful, like an exchange rate, to act as a buffer to absorb some of the consequences of that shock, the Nigerian authorities held or tried to hold that exchange rate steady for a long time, and this meant that the real economy was forced to contract instead. When you hear about all of the policies aimed at demand management, trying to control imports, it's very difficult to try to control imports, to try to sustain a certain level of foreign exchange reserves. It's very difficult to do that and to get growth. Essentially, what you're saying is, we won't allow the economy to grow, so people don't need to import that much. That is the adjustment path that has been forced on the economy in the short term. In the 1970s, similar policies were tried. We don't see an industrialized Nigeria today, and most economists seem to think, well, the outcomes are not going to be too different this time around. So to really see more of a recovery in the Nigerian economy, what needs to give a little is policy. It needs to be made more sustainable. At this moment in time, we don't see clear signs that this is going to happen. This is going to be a key test, not just electricity supply has been improving, will improve further through to 2018. We know that the drought that was a significant constraint on agricultural growth isn't going to be as much of a constraint over the coming year. But what's really missing in South Africa is private sector confidence, investor confidence. If you're not seeing the investment decisions being made now that will lift growth over the medium term, it's very difficult to project anything above 2% growth for the South African economy. Even as you see the cyclical boost, last year's growth was very low, so there's a low base in place. It doesn't take much to grow faster. The big test that South Africa faces is whether, with rising debt levels, it is able to maintain its investment grade rating. And the next round of ratings reviews come pretty soon. They come in June. Given the political uncertainty, no one's quite clear how things will be decided. It's going to be very difficult to see changes happening that will drive much faster growth by June. So this threat for South Africa hasn't gone away. Africa in 2017, on the whole, is going to look slightly better, but that's never going to be a uniform picture. What's changing globally? The fear of protectionism. Everyone was watching Trump's press conference today. What are we going to see? More detail required. How quickly are more protectionist policies going to be put in place? The suggestion was pretty quickly. Nothing has changed in terms of the rhetoric. But there are uncertainties. If a big fiscal boost to the US economy is promised, is that going to boost growth globally? Or are the downsides, are the negatives associated with more protectionist policies going to offset that? What we do know is that Africa is unlikely to be the target of any of that protectionism. But we also know that in today's interconnected world, especially with emerging markets that will be targeted, facing the brunt of those protectionist policies, that anything that weakens emerging market growth, given the extent to which Africa's trade growth has been driven by deeper ties with those economies, that's not going to be good news for Africa. So yes, there's an offset. Oil prices have rallied, partly on the OPEC decision to cut supply, and maybe there are stronger fundamentals in place for oil. When we look at other commodities, the big moves up in copper, it's not clear necessarily that those can be sustained. So we are going to be looking at a more difficult external environment for Africa. Finally, maybe just a big picture summing up. We know that in reaction to the global financial crisis, African economies did benefit a great deal from the very accommodative monetary policy that had been put in place. Low interest rates, unusual monetary policy, very accommodative in most of the developed countries, meant that it became much cheaper for a whole host of different African sovereigns to finance themselves by issuing external debt. But we're getting closer to the time when that debt issued 4 years ago is going to mature. We're probably midway through that process. From around 2022, 2023 on, we're going to see what we call a concentration of these debt maturities. And this means that African economies, to be able to preserve market access, really need to prove that they can reform, that they can satisfy investors, that they're still safe bets, that they are able to refinance this debt comfortably. They need to be able to drive confidence in the near term. And given difficult external conditions, given the fact that interest rates in the US have started to rise, that Treasury yields could go much higher if we see more expansionary fiscal policy in the US, it's going to raise the bar for African economies. Different countries are going to have to try even harder to show that they're still good credits, that they're doing the right thing, that they're putting in place the reforms that will sustain growth in the medium term. And they're going to have to do this at a time when the global picture looks very much more uncertain. So yes, on the one hand, we can say 2017, it's got to be better than 2016. It would take some doing for a repeat performance from the likes of South Africa and Nigeria. Not impossible, but most people feel that the regional average is going to be picking up. For Africa, the big question is that growth going to be enough? Are we ever going to see that return to 6-7% type growth? Are we ever going to be able to say comfortably, because of where we are in the investment cycle, because more governments are doing the right thing with long-term savings, long-term investment, that the Africa Rising story is back? What we think we'll see in 2017 is cyclically higher growth, but the reformers will really need to distinguish themselves to demonstrate that they can achieve more than that.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. Thank you very much indeed for that economic outlook for Africa. So, our next speaker is Professor Chuks Okereke. He is a professor of climate and development at Reading University. Climate and Development Studies. I missed a word out, I thought I had. And also visiting professor at Oxford University. And Chooks, you've also advised the British government, the World Bank and the United Nations on a variety of issues. And you're going to talk to us about climate change in Africa and also some positive news you see in low carbon projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know that many people like to say this about their research or subject area, but I really genuinely think that low carbon initiatives or green growth and the issues around how it is conceived and implemented in Africa is one of the most important subject areas facing Africa today. Why do I say that? Well, because climate change, with its negative consequences related to flooding, sea level rise, drought, and other changes in weather patterns, can totally derail African development and the gains that we have seen in the past decade. And if attention or solutions to climate change is ineffective, then the whole of Africa can be consigned into the future of darkness, poverty, famine, and underdevelopment in the next 20 years or so. Already in Nigeria, for example, in 2011 and 2012, there has been unprecedented levels of flooding that has cost the country billions, and according to some projections, about 0.7% of its GDP. Then we also have unprecedented degrees of drought in Southern Africa, although that is now easing. Africa is clearly the most vulnerable continent to climate change, and the future doesn't look good. There are some projections that if some countries actually want to take climate change into account, but in their budget and national development, it's going to take about 500% of the current cost of development, and that is serious. And all the projections out there suggest that we need, or Africa needs, an inflow of finance to the tune of giving some estimate, billions of dollars per annum, and that is not happening. So climate change poses a very, very significant risk to African development. And as Raisa has been saying, we also know, given the slow of growth that we have seen in the past few years, that Africa cannot really rely on, untrammeled exploitation of natural resources to fund its future growth. There has to be structural transformation, and a key part of it will be around the issue of renewable energy and green industrialization. And so what we now face is a situation where business as usual growth cannot really be the future for Africa, but at the same time, Africa needs accelerated industrialization and economic growth in a way that is very sensitive to global changing climate. Now, this is important, especially in the context of global trends, some of which Raisa has already mentioned. If, for example, we have Trump really, taking off the brakes on oil production in the U.S., then what we could see is much less importation of oil from the U.S. And so far, U.S. accounts for a significant portion of the import of oil from Nigeria and other African countries. And that slow in importation of oil from the U.S. will further dampen growth. If China, for example, pushes ahead with some of its aggressive policies on renewable energy, that again can lead to less importation of Africa's natural resources and further dampen economic prospects in the continent. Then also we have Brexit here, which may have negative consequences for Africa on a range of different scales. We already have, for example, the right-wing media in the UK really pushing hard against the 0.7 dedication economic aid to developing countries. And if this right-wing media has their way, then clearly what we might see is far less funding going to support African development initiatives. Now, this is why, one of the reasons why I feel it's really bad is because at the core of it, climate change is a justice problem, and I'm going to perhaps talk a bit more on that. But on the positive side, Africa actually has a comparative advantage when it comes to natural resources. And there are opportunities for Africa to really harness its natural resources to mount a renewable energy revolution in Africa. And this is why it is gratifying to note that a number of African countries are actually making giant strides in the area of green growth and low carbon development. In 2011, for example, I was privileged to be part of the team that drafted one of the first low carbon development strategy at the national level for the government of Rwanda, which emphasized harvesting natural gas from Lake Kivu, but also geothermal energy and low carbon housing opportunities. Coming at the heel of that also late in 2011, Ethiopia launched also a very ambitious green growth strategy. And the thrust of it was green industrialization, but also the idea of reforesting large portions of rural and mountainous areas in Ethiopia. Ethiopia also is developing the biggest dam in Africa, about 74 million cubic in volume, and installed capacity of about 500 megawatts. So there are positive developments in the space. Another good example would be Morocco, which has a commitment to build one of the largest concentrated solar power power station. And the idea, if it goes ahead and is successful, will be that by around 2020, this concentrated solar power project is going to supply about 42% of Morocco's energy mix. Then we also have in May last year, the first East African country in Kenya signing a national climate change legislation, which commits the country to ambitious climate change initiatives in the area of adaptation, but also in the area of mitigation. Other interesting initiatives can be found in Botswana, in Ghana, and to a limited extent in Nigeria and South Africa. The key constraint that we see in our research remains finance, but also very low human and institutional capacity to really conceptualize and implement the low carbon developments. So looking ahead, one of the key things that we're going to be watching out for 2017 is scale. And that is the extent to which some of these budding initiatives can really be scaled up and then, in our language, mainstreamed into the national economic agenda. Now, if you are an economist, you like to think about climate change as something, of how do you internalize economic externalities. And this is, I often say that economists are kind of the high priests that are admitted into the temple of global climate change decision making. And so that's why you have this kind of EU ETS, but also to a limited extent what we call the climate development mechanism. Now, if you are a techno person, you like to think of climate change as a technical or a technological problem. And so your emphasis would be kind of on carbon capture storage or weathering technologies like geoengineering. But for a large portion of Africans, climate change is essentially a moral problem. And the chief moral question here is about justice. And there are three asymmetries that implicate climate change and justice, and I'll run through them very quickly. First is asymmetry in contribution. The mere fact that we have about 20% of the population, mostly Western countries, contributing about 80% of at least historical climate change. The second, so this raises very important justice questions around distribution of burden. The second asymmetry is asymmetry in impact. I already mentioned that Africa is the most vulnerable to climate change. And this raises particularly morally challenging questions because what we now have is the country that is, or the continent that is least responsible for climate change, now being the one that's bearing the brunt of climate change. And then the third asymmetry is asymmetry in the power to decide. We know, despite some progress that has been made over the last couple of years, that Africa has the least voice and command in terms of shaping a global climate change policy. And all these three asymmetries are undergirded by a more fundamental asymmetry, which is structural injustice inherent in long colonial histories and even current structural global injustice. And so the question really remains, how do you forge a global climate change that is sensitive to these asymmetries? There are three ways to do that. One is what we call differentiation in burden sharing. That has fallen by the wayside with the Paris Agreement, emphasizing universality and comprehensiveness. The second way is compensation. I don't see any traction in this. We have a caveat in the Paris Agreement saying, there's a bar against compensation. And the third is pursuing green growth and low carbon development strategies. And this is where all what I've told you are really important, that one of the justice avenues for getting justice for Africa is really releasing more finances to African countries to be able to really take the bull by the horn and forge economic development agendas that are simultaneously bold but also sensitive to climate change. And what we are thinking is that there are at least two important developments in this area. Both in Nigeria and South Africa, there are now serious thinking to float green bonds, but also to release trillions of dollars, which have been residing in government bonds, to really now fund green investments in Africa. But also the African Resource Panel is thinking very hard about how to convert the illicit flow of finances and channel it back to Africa to use to fund green growth. For every, I think, $1 that goes from the West to Africa, we know that about $14 goes from Africa to the West. So we need to really rethink this paradigm of aid. And Africa doesn't need aid. Africa needs to stop the illicit flow of finances, but also to generate internal revenues and use it to fund green growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chuks. Thank you very much indeed, Chuks. And to my left, Njoki Ngumi is a writer and feminist thinker from Kenya. She's also a doctor of medicine and practiced in both the private and public healthcare sector in Kenya, but she's now with the Nest Collective, where she works as a filmmaker, and it's a creative collective. And you'd like to talk to us, Njoki, about the cultural scene in Africa, but also about women, youth, and minorities. So please do make your opening remarks. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I think one of the things that has made me a little contemplative about the heading prospects and forecasts is that it becomes increasingly difficult to forecast anything when you're living in a dystopia. When you look on Twitter and you see there's a world president being accused of sexual acts, and then the whole world gets involved in this conversation as though like he's our relative. I don't know what in such an environment is predictable anymore. And like, it's funny, but it's also immensely tragic, And so one of the questions that we have to ask as creators of cultural content and as practitioners in the creative economy is, how do you design cultural goods, services, and experiences for futures you cannot predict anymore? A lot of the conversations we've had so far today are about politics and economics, and those are conversations around hard power. But what do we say about the soft power of a region that produces less than 1% of global cultural content in the whole world, which has to be fictionalized, to be called Wakanda, to be understood by the mainstream, and which is used to being consumed in pieces through the eyes of charity, through eyes of violence, always through the eyes of subservience. And where, when Africa creates beautiful things, they have to have a purpose, beauty for social enterprise, beauty to educate, beauty to tell people that we should not be having FGM. You can't just have a piece of art that's art. What are you trying to say as an African? What's your message to the rest of Africa? You know what I mean? And so let's talk about people. When I think about people in Africa, if you can ever think about people in the whole of Africa. I like to think primarily of youth and women, and I like to call those functional minorities, because even though Sankara tells us that women hold up half the sky, women are painfully underrepresented where decisions are being made about how money is being spent. The easiest place to see this is in the church, where women are the ones who are giving most of the money and singing all of the songs, but when the vision is being given to the people, it is being given by men. But women and youth are often the ones who are informally employed, and so are least likely to be able to even harness enough money to survive, let alone make investments and ultimately build wealth. And so we have to ask ourselves, because these are the people who stand to gain most from investment in the cultural and creative economies, who they end up becoming the working class. And when we ask ourselves who the working class are, somebody did some research in Kenya the other day, and they found out that 1 in 3 of the new jobs that are being created are in private security. And what does private security mean? Essentially, it's poor people guarding the stuff for rich people, or poor women taking care of the children of women who can afford to pay them. You know what I mean? So it extends even into domestic work and things like that. And it becomes even youth who go into tertiary institutions, whether it's polytechnics or colleges or universities, and who are being trained for a market that is shrinking and ultimately does not exist. So we have all these kids that are going into school to learn all these things, to then go and do what is called tarmacking, where you're walking between places and giving your CV all the time, and nobody's going to be able to give you a job. So we have this pseudo working class, because maybe do they consider what they're doing work, or do they actually even get the chance to work? And so these same people are being told, start a business, you can do better. And can we really then entrepreneur ourselves out of poverty and out of bad governance, as Oriokolo would ask? So that's people. With regard to potential for the creative and cultural economies, it's good. I think it has the potential to leapfrog us into immense possibilities, creating goods and services and experiences that both local and international markets desperately want to consume. And where, in an environment where traditional industries are becoming more and more shaky, where we end up clearing tea farms so that people can build apartments to rent out, because that brings in money faster. Again, we also find a place where we tend to start holding on to kind of heritage cultural outputs, so that we can give dignity to our troubled pasts that we haven't really kind of come to terms with, whether it's colonialism or the troubles of the post-colony. There's also potential for us to kind of reposition ourselves in this world narrative. And when we make characters, when we make cultural content, are we able to make the world care about the characters that we dream and think up, whether they're classical or contemporary characters in the real Africa, not in Wakanda? Are we able to make the world care about our characters the way they care about the characters on Downton Abbey or in Sherlock, or the wardrobe of what people are wearing on The Crown? You know what I mean? Is it possible? Should we think through the possibilities that it may not be? Should it be possible? Should we be aiming to kind of hit it big on the quote-unquote world stage, if such a thing exists anymore? On the other hand, there's ways in which East Africa, which is where I come from, because Kenya is a country in East Africa, is the new kind of hotspot for the discovery of art, and kind of art collectors are kind of focusing their eyes on who's the new thing coming from here. There's ways in which Eastern Africa was always kind of seen as a cultural wasteland. Like you see, there's West Africa and all the beautiful things happening there, and Northern Africa, and then everyone just kind of would keep quiet and then move quickly into Southern Africa, because we can really talk about art that comes from there. But more and more, there's people that are looking towards Eastern Africa as kind of this new, fun, trendy place. Again, also, cultural and creative entrepreneurs are attracting market investment from angel investors, from venture capitalists, from development investment, people who are looking to invest in a different kind of business because these other business arenas are not showing as much returns as they traditionally did. Let's talk about problems in this kind of area. We've started to ask ourselves important questions about what the origins of our futures are. What are the problematics of idealized kind of Afrofuturisms, where we have to live in the shadows of the aspirations of the global North? What do we think is sacred to us as Africans that has never been dreamed for us before? When we think about development, do we want our rolling hills to be the same as the rolling hills in Aberdeen or in some other village? When we look at our villages, do we see only the gap that exists between Murang'a, which is in central Kenya, and again Aberdeen, which is in northern Scotland? And do we want Murang'a to look like Aberdeen, or do we want Murang'a to look like itself in another future that we haven't dreamed yet? When we talk about creating cultural content, again, we have to discuss the limits to freedom of expression, and especially the politicization of dissent and disagreement as threats to peace. Again, we also have to talk about the increased focus on elections as exercises of democracy, and where we don't talk at all about citizenship, and where the troubling thing around being a citizen in Africa is where you kind of have to earn your belonging and your citizenship by being a nice, high-quality citizen who can pay for your own health and pay for your own education and pay for your own security, and then give taxes to be able to have a passport with your country's name on it, where your country's pretty much not doing anything from you, but expecting everything from you. And you can see why brain drain happens, where people go so that their labors can, have more fruit elsewhere. And it makes sense, and it's not ethical, but it's practical. When we talk about the limits of government support, for cultural and creative economies, where this is an economy that's poised to be able to enable African countries to leap forward in incredible ways, but there are no real subsidies and no political will to do things that aren't quote-unquote real jobs. And so there's so much dependence on donor funding to be able to grow this kind of nascent economy. And when we talk about that, we can see donor funding everywhere is going down, and everybody's kind of tending to look inwards. And so what are the cultural and creative economies going to do because of that? Again, for places that haven't necessarily had the luxury of exposure to what they call white cubes and black boxes, access to museums and galleries and performance spaces. And so for us, where the stages are happening in marketplaces and where our installations are the patches of grass in urban centers that people have to be stopped from walking on. How can we then start having conversations about art as a public good and as a human right when the possibilities for high quality public art that is designed to invite and start conversation, and this public art has to exist in spaces that were built to host very few people, and where there's still laws against loitering, as though you can loiter if you're a citizen in your own country. And in places and spaces that are increasingly militarized and securitized because of the fears of terrorism, So when we talk about, yes, art is a public good, how do we make sure that as many people as possible have access to these kinds of artistic spaces? And how do we negotiate the kind of odd binary between these physical and digital publicnesses that both create such easy accessibility to the rest of the world, but again, can be so easily taken away in the name of peace, in the name of morality, in the name of security, and how even then can we talk about those in the frame of the reduced mobilities, where there are higher barriers for Africans to travel, to see new things, to experience new things, even in other countries, and then whether they decide that they want to go back or not, and in ways in which citizens of other places don't experience the same kind of gaps in the ways in which they can move back and forth. I've said a lot of abstract things, and I want to finalize with a few more. I'm really sorry for you people for like kind of having to negotiate these kinds of odd, questiony spaces. I really had no interest in being able to say this is the kind of magic button that we're going to press as the cultural and creative economies, and then everything will just kind of blow forth and explode into goodness and beauty and wealth. That's probably not going to happen. But I loved when Razia talked about Africa Rising, because our question, especially even as the Nest Collective, is always who is Africa rising for? What is it rising towards, or is it ever going to be able to rise past this kind of invisible glass ceiling? What does power look like in the world today? And when we look via our capitalist frame, power in the world is the ability to buy. It is the ability to say no to the cheapest items. It is the ability to say no to the hardest and the most thankless labor. It's the ability to not need a special iPhone made for your geographical region that comes with 4-wheel drive and that you can charge when there is no power, you know, it's the ability to not need a fridge that can also chase away mosquitoes. It's the ability to not need innovation porn, where people kind of gather to watch and see what you can do with bad governance and glitter and hopes and dreams, you know. And so we need to kind of ask ourselves if there is such a thing as a global train that is heading somewhere. What part does Africa have in deciding where this train is going? Are we just riders? Are we participating? Can we say that we want to drive? What does that look like? Can we derail the train? Is it even possible? Is that a thing that we can think through being able to do with cultural content in ways that we cannot in political and economic spheres? And what does power look like when blackness wears it?
Okay, thank you. Well, we have about half an hour now for questions. But just before we go to the floor and you're preparing your thoughts, panel, is there anything you'd like to raise amongst one another? I mean, Patrick, you started off, you mentioned Donald Trump. What do all of you think a Trump presidency might mean for Africa from your own perspectives, if anything? He hasn't said anything about Africa, I don't think. We've gone from an African-American president to a new president who's hasn't even mentioned Africa.
Well, he did spend 4 years trying to prove that the incumbent president of the US was actually born in Africa. That was his main contribution to the debate about Africa. And failed, and then lied that he'd ever done it in the first place. So I think we're going to see a lot of post-truth and false news coming from the Twitter feed of Donald J. Trump. His Assistant Secretary of State is likely to be a guy called Peter Pham, who is currently based at the Atlantic Center, which is funded by an extremely wealthy Iranian exile. Peter is a fairly distinguished academic, but he's on the sort of right side of politics, as in neo-liberal, or neo-liberal plus, I guess, alt-right, perhaps. So, yeah, believes in robust military action. Michael Flynn, the man who was kicked out of the Defense Intelligence Agency for being too crazily too crazy. Full stop. He's going to be his national security advisor. He's brought in a couple of people who are going to take the African work in the Development Intelligence Agency and are very bullish and very interventionist and full of drones and other such devices. So I think you're going to see a very much more militarized policy. Not that it's been unmilitarized in the last 8 years, it has to be said. I think it's going to be more so militarized. And I don't think it's going to be so much of a plan. If there has been a plan in the last 8 years, I guess there has been. I think it's going to be more random, more unpredictable. I think also, if he takes the trade war with China to its logical conclusion, I think Africa's going to kind of, depends how, Africa can navigate that. It could actually sort of try and play, Africa, trade China, Russia, and the US against, and Europe against them, and sort of get some advantage out of this kind of competition.
Sure.
But I think that, the overall effect, I think, will be, it's what Nixon used to call his policy towards the inner cities in the 60s and 70s. Those of you who are as old as me and can remember it, it was called benign neglect. We're not going to come around and mess you up deliberately unless you annoy us.
Right.
But if you don't annoy us, we'll just leave you to sort of sit,
Right.
And we won't interfere. And I think that's the sort of
Thing we're going to
attitude
get.
you see.
And economically, we know that Obama tried latterly in his presidency with the Africa Summit in 2014, I think it was, to try to catch up with China's engagement economically with Africa. Long way to go, but what do you think economically we're going to see from
Well,
America?
a little bit of the market interpretation so far is that we'll see the emergence of a more hawkish Fed over time. So we've been in an environment of low interest rates. We're going to see higher US interest rates, and this will necessarily mean that it becomes much more expensive to finance any investment in Africa that's dependent on external borrowing. We might also see a continuation of currency volatility. It's not quite clear just yet, but we could see a stronger dollar re-emerging. We haven't seen this in a big way in most sub-Saharan African markets since 2015. So a lot of those negatives with weaker currencies, perhaps a little bit of volatility in commodities, markets will have to make their minds up about whether US growth, higher US growth, is it going to happen? Is it going to be good for commodities? But chances are that the focus will be on that more difficult financing environment for Africa. This is a long way of saying perhaps that things are going to get tougher. And the easy money, cheap to finance spending, it's not necessarily going to be there. But there's also an opportunity for a lot of African countries in this, and that is to finally start being serious about economic reforms. We know that the story of the last decade or so in Africa has been about greater reliance on external borrowing. The cheap money was there, it happened, it was responsible for some of the growth. What we haven't seen is a sustained effort at really good revenue mobilization in Africa. That kind of goes hand in hand with democracy, and maybe we need to see a return to that sort of focus for this to succeed. What we haven't seen is a strong record since the global financial crisis of higher savings rates in Africa. And maybe this deteriorating external environment is going to force that in a lot of countries. So for now, it looks kind of frightening, and you'd be a little bit apprehensive about the economic implications, but it's very difficult to say exactly which way things are going to turn out.
African leaders are urging exactly what you've just said. If you think of Akin Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank, who's urging African countries to go for greater fiscal consolidation, isn't he? And, more domestic resource mobilization. He's pointed, I think, to the fiscal GDP ratio in African countries is about half of what it is in developed countries. In other words, African countries don't raise enough money from tax, which is not very popular. So we're going to look perhaps to Africa look into itself more in this new environment of benign neglect, which is coming from Washington. Just very quickly to you, Chooks, given that Donald Trump has said climate change is just weather, you're not going to get many green bucks to bring that green growth that you said in your comments we needed.
Well, yes. I think I was trying to allude to this in my speech, that there are at least three key ways through which Donald Trump's presidency can impact on Africa. If he goes on to deny climate change, and if he manages to pull the U.S. out of the global climate deal, to the extent that the ambitious target is derailed, then first of all, what you will see is accelerated climate change in Africa, which will have devastating economic consequences, as I've already indicated. But also there will be, and I think Riza was alluding to this, there will be a drying up of funding within the climate change arena. So the Green Climate Fund, for example, America is a major contributor to that. You can expect that to dry up. So these are the two key ways. But also there's a third and perhaps even more important way, which is what kind of policies he's going to drive in terms of domestic oil production. If he goes ahead, as he has indicated that he will do, by removing what he calls shackles on, ExxonMobil and other oil-producing companies, and then there's a glut of oil in the U.S., then this will impact negatively on importation of oil from Africa, and this also is going to dramatically harm economic prospects.
And Njoki, very quickly, Trump presidency, from your perspective, culturally or otherwise, what does it mean for Africa?
You know the way you try not to talk about someone, and I think I can say two things. One is that culturally, there's a lot of things about Trump's massive gray areas, to put them euphemistically, that are familiar. And so, like, I remember a time when, on Twitter fairly recently, when somebody came and made this beautiful idealist statement that, because Trump is appointing only rich people to the government, it means they're not going to really need to steal from public coffers. and so some Kenyan, some witty Kenyan kind of retweeted it and quoted and said, so who's going to tell them? And there's ways in which we know what despots look like. And so it'll be very interesting to see the kind of art people create in response to the despots. More on the economic side of the creative economy. The one thing that Trump said that we kind of discussed for days in the office, at least with my coworkers, was that they're going to kind of revisit every single trade agreement that America has signed with anybody in the world. One of those is AGOA, naturally, and there's so many kind of creative goods that are exported to the US because of AGOA, and definitely if AGOA is revisited and shortened, because we just kind of received an extension for another 10 years, then that's going to impact severely on the exports that are made by creative entrepreneurs. So I think that's a thing to watch for sure.
Thank you. AGOA, of course, the African Growth Opportunity Act, that I think Clinton brought that in, didn't he?
Yeah.
Okay. Any brief comments, actually? Just comments would do as well, because we've only got about 15, 20 minutes. Yeah, Henry there, I see, and somebody at the back. Would you give a microphone, please, Caitlin, to Henry Bonsu, and one there. Yeah. There's somebody right at the back. Put your hand up again so you get the mic. Yeah, there you go.
Hi, I was wondering what you think the prospects are for Rwanda. Because I think they've got an election this year, did they not? A lot of people were putting Paul Kagame in the same basket as some of the other African overstayers, but I know lots of Rwandans who say, we want him to stay. Others who say, it's time for him to leave, even though he's doing a good job. What do you think?
Okay, thank you, Henry Bonsu from Ghana. That's fine. And Rwanda, yeah, we'll take another. We'll take two or three. Go ahead.
Just turn it on there.
You hear me?
Yes.
Yep. I was fascinated by the professor's comment that he thought Brexit was a risk, because I think that actually Brexit is an opportunity for Africa, because you have a UK government which now is obsessed with expanding its influence in the world outside of Europe, and particularly given the cultural and economic links in much of Anglophone Africa, and that Britain for the first time has a Department of International Trade, that there's an opportunity that you might get British trade deals which are on much better terms than the EU ones, which are forced reciprocal terms on African countries, which allow European countries to flood African markets, which is in contrast, of course, to AGOA, which isn't reciprocal. So isn't Brexit an opportunity for Africa if they start to engage with Britain?
Thank you. Yes, the lady here. Introduce yourself, sorry, by the way, and your organisation, if relevant.
Dorcas Guata, working in Global Health in Africa and here in the UK. I can't believe we're talking about Trump being in office, but we are where we are. We had the Ebola crisis in Africa just 2 years ago. Now we're Global Health. And we were able to respond to that crisis, which was shocking the continent. We were able to learn lessons. I'm trying to think how a Trump era would manage to respond to an Ebola crisis today. What then? What questions then and answers might we begin to ask ourselves today, and how the world will respond, the UK, US will respond to epidemics in Africa?
That might have to be it's a bit hypothetical, interesting question, but we'll take it as a kind of sort of comment. This lady here at the front, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Corinne, and I work for a charity called the Africa Centre in London. I have a question for Mr. Patrick Smith. You have expressed part of your view regarding Donald Trump. I am very curious, my parents being Congolese, and myself being very passionate about what has been happening in Congo. What do you think actually of Tshisekedi and Katumbi? Because from where I am sitting, I was 5 years old when my mom and dad in the living room was like, oh my God, Tshisekedi is our savior. A few months back, I asked my mom, 25 years later, she's like, oh, he's just an old-timer trying to make his way. And when it comes to Katumbi, my dad being born in Kananga, which is Kasai, one of the richest regions of Congo, I guess my second question is that, is it legitimate to assume that from an international perspective, the desire to see transition is more actually to keep on getting more preferential access to Congolese natural resources?
So we take it you're a supporter of Joseph Kabila?
No, that's not what I'm saying.
No.
I am just wondering.
Okay, all right.
What's the deal there?
All right, very quickly on that one. Etienne Tshisekedi and Moise Katumbi on that very quickly.
Yeah, look, I mean, Tshisekedi has been around a long time. That's why I identify with him, I guess. No, seriously, not seriously, he's a really brave guy, and he was tortured very badly by Mobutu. He put up with a lot. He led the democracy movement in Congolese, so sort of chapeau to him for that. I think that you've got to give him that. I agree, a lot of us are past it, and it would be much better if a younger, more dynamic force, hopefully a woman, came along and took over. No problems. Moise Katumbi was governor of Katanga. A lot of wealth was lifted out of Katanga in the last 20 years, some of it under Katumbi's watch. He is no angel, but neither is the man who is currently sitting in Kinshasa in the palace there and is in no hurry to go. I think, it's a bit like Hillary and Trump, It would be nice if both of them lost.
But her question is no agenda to try to...
Sorry,
there's no hidden agenda to maintain access to DRC's reserves by getting regime change.
I mean, Kabila has brought in all manner of international rogues and thugs and crooks and stripped Congo as thoroughly as Mobutu did. So what would be good is if we can get a true nationalist to come in, win an election democratically in Congo, and stop that pillage of Congo's resources.
All right.
And then, I think out of all those, maybe Katumbi's more, perhaps, but, we're talking relative. I mean, let's have someone else. Let's have you. I mean, why not?
Yeah, why not? Okay. And then very quickly on Henry's question about Kagame, Paul Kagame in Rwanda, a lot of Rwandans say to him, we're happy that he's
I
running
think
for a
he's
third
now
term.
set himself up for another 30 years in power. That's the latest constitutional change. It is quite remarkable that he's able to sort of stand up in international fora and say, look at Kabila, he's messing around, he doesn't want to go.
But his point was a lot of Rwandans say to him that they want to see him maintain the stability.
And there's also the Green Party, and there's also those Rwandans who have opposed him in the past and have met, like Patrick Karegeya, fairly unpleasant ends in overseas hotel rooms. I think, yeah, you know, there's a stellar economic record there. No one's going to argue about that, a bit like Ethiopia. But the politics is not stellar, it's messy. And it's in danger of getting messier. And I think, you know, there's nothing that would suit him so much as he's going at this stage. I mean, there's a, you know, a genius economist, manager sitting there without a job at the moment. His name is Donald Kaberuka. Why not give him a chance? Why not move over and let the man who actually engineered the hard work that created the economic boom in Rwanda, why not let Donald Kaberuka take over? He'll never say that himself, but I'm
Are
suggesting
you his
that's
campaign
an
manager?
option.
Good
Yeah,
God.
actually, yeah, if the price is right.
Chooks, we had that question. You had said in your presentation that the 0.7% of GDP that the British government under David Cameron said, continued to say they were committed to meeting is now being rowed back on probably by Priti Patel. You said, therefore, that's an example of how Brexit is bad for Africa. But gentleman says, surely not.
In an event in Ethiopia many years ago, we had a very top British politician who really led in China and talked about how China's investment was bad for Africa, promoting inequality, and on he went. And I was really pensive, and I wondered what the next speaker was going to say, who was a very top Ethiopian politician. In his response, the Ethiopian politician said, if a Chinese investor comes to say to me that we want to bring investment to Ethiopia, I will have only one question to ask, and that is, where do I sign? You know, so this was a very interesting way of saying, look, that there is such hypocrisy, you know, that have been, you know, promoted by the British colonial masters about, you know, this kind of romantic relationship that they have with Africa, that they are the only ones that know how to treat Africa and make it right. Quite frankly, Britain has never cared for Africa as much as it should, given it, you know, its pillage and the extraction of resources that is profited from Africa for donkeys of years. Why on earth will it suddenly change? Because, you know, we have kind of outmaneuvered ourselves out of the single market in Europe.
Okay.
You're
sticking to what you said, in other words. Brexit's bad.
This is not to say that there might not be some opportunities, but I really think that the risks outweigh the opportunity.
Okay, very briefly, yes, because then I'm just going to take some more comments from the floor, and then you'll have your closing remarks. Briefly,
Okay, maybe
Razia.
just a few trade statistics on that and the idea that Britain could be doing a lot more with Africa. We know that despite the massive rise of trade between China and Africa, it is Europe, if you see it as a single entity, that is Africa's largest trading partner, accounting for about 27% of the share of trade with sub-Saharan Africa. The UK's share in that, about 3%. And the really remarkable fact is that over that time when African economies were outperforming, growing a lot faster than the global average, the UK's trade share with Africa was actually shrinking over that time. So the precedent isn't necessarily great, and you might think a new focus, new trade relationships, perhaps there's some hope, perhaps that can be reignited. The problem is there's a great deal of uncertainty to come even before we get there. So you're looking at perhaps weaker import demand as a result of currency fluctuations. You're talking about the uncertainty with trade deals having to be renegotiated. The reality is that share of trade is unlikely to be increasing anytime soon. And if Brexit is supposedly a great opportunity for African economies, there aren't many policymakers in Africa who are looking at it that way right now.
Thank you. Right, microphones. Can I see hands? So, quite a lot. Okay. Yeah, the lady in red has been waiting for a long time. So, Caitlin, or whoever it is there, sorry, the microphone there. And one here, please, Caitlin. Give it to gentleman here. Very, very briefly, everybody, and then panel, I'm just going to come to you for your closing remarks. So listen up what you wish to reply to. Yeah.
Lindsay Northover, I'm the Lib Dem spokesperson on foreign affairs and House of Lords and also trade envoy for the UK to Angola. And I wanted to, I could certainly comment on Brexit. I certainly haven't come across any country in Africa which thought that that was the route we should go down for the reasons that Razi has just laid out. I want to make a couple of comments, one on the green side and the presentation that we just heard. One of the things that's quite striking is the way that Africa is leapfrogging the rest of the world in the development of green energy. And I think that's immensely encouraging, and it's rather like what happens with mobile telephony and mobile banking. And in terms of Trump, one of the things the Americans built into the Paris Climate Change Conference was that if you had ratified that treaty, you couldn't withdraw from it for 3 years, and you then had to give a year's notice. Now, they may have been clairvoyant. Now, whether or not what Trump did, what Obama did, will count as ratification, we'll see. But there is that protection, which I think is quite useful. The other thing is that the UN says that at the moment they're not yet getting adequate grant applications for the money that is already there, and flag that to African countries, as I do in Angola. But my question was about China. What I want to know is much more about China's economic and political involvement in Africa as you see it. We heard a little bit about how it might be affected by protectionism from the US, but I'd like to know more about that involvement.
Razi, that might be one for you when we come to the end. Yeah, who else? Where's the microphone? Yep, there you go. And could you pass the microphone to, who's been waiting a long time? Just pass it to the gentleman there. Very briefly, everybody, like 30 seconds.
Yes. Benedict Seagarden, I'm with Oxford Analytica here in the UK. My question would be for Ms. Khan. Given all the political risk we've heard from Mr. Smith and his ally there, how resilient do you see companies and investors in sub-Saharan Africa moving into 2017? We saw that Ivory Coast had the kerfuffle this weekend, but the bond price didn't move. In Ethiopia as well, despite protests, the garment industry seems to be staying there, but then in South Africa, a lot of people have left the oil fields. So with these different types of risks of different escalations, how strong are investors committed there despite this political risk?
Thank you. Caitlin, just give the, I think you've been waiting a long time, the chap there with the jersey.
I've also got the mic.
And you've got the mic? Go on then.
Roddy Barkley.
Who's got the mic? Okay, yes, go ahead. This chap in the specs, and then you, yeah.
Roddy Barkley from the consulting firm Africa Practice. My question is primarily to Razia, but Patrick, you might also have some views on this. It's around Nigeria and whether you feel the economic and institutional situation in Nigeria justifies Buhari's plans to raise 30 billion in debt. Whether you think that is the best route for Nigeria out of its current economic situation, or whether you think it might be the beginning of another debt cycle.
Okay.
And also, I guess, the sort of viability of the debt sources that they're looking at.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Andrew Reischer. I'm an investor in Africa Rising and green energy in Africa. And so I would sort of naturally fall into Razia and Patrick's camp, but I don't actually. I would like to give a word to Njoki. Africa Rising is interesting, it's real, it's about 10% of the population. 90% of the population is irrelevant. So for Njoki's point about all these graduates without jobs, wearing out their shoes, all these people going into domestic service, for them, what we're talking about around the economics and the politics is irrelevant. And I'd like to know when there's going to be some leadership, some true African leadership that's going to do something different to the neoliberal consensus to improve the position of the 80 to 90% of Africans to whom this all doesn't matter.
Thank you. Very powerful. Who's got the microphone? Yeah. Ushers with microphones, best to just give them to hands raised unless you want to ask a question yourself. Yes, one there. Any on that side? No, there's one here. And then we'll take that. There are 3 here. Yeah, go ahead. Briefly.
Sudanese activist. Africa in 2017, prospects and forecasts. By definition, it is social economic developments. My question is to Patrick. In terms of IGAD bloc, we have a problem of security in Sudan and South Sudan. And we also have new United Nations Secretary General. How can we have development and there is no security in those two countries? And what that affects the whole region of IGAD?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes?
Michael, I'm in Invest in Africa. Is Nana Akufo-Addo picking the right minister to transform Ghana?
Let's hope he doesn't take 6 months like Muhammadu Buhari did. Right. Okay, that's it. Oh, one final one, and then we'll call it a day. At the back there, chap. Oh, there's a chap there. Sorry, go ahead. And then one to him, and then that's it. One there, and then one there. Yeah.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Usman Job. I would like to ask a question around currency and nationalism. So we've been seeing a bigger growth in Africa of from these people calling for countries basically getting rid of all the old colonial currencies like the franc CFA in Senegal or West Africa, for example. So what would be the opportunities of getting rid of that currency and having a national currency?
Okay.
Whether it's regional or national.
Okay. God, they're all coming to you, Razia, aren't they? God. Okay, final point.
Nine Capital also to Razia, sorry. To get to debt capital markets, we've seen the hard currency bonds issued by several sub-Saharan countries. I think with rising interest rates and difficulty around those, you might see emergence finally of some strong trade domestic capital markets, which people have been talking about for years, but really haven't happened. And if so, where?
So, strong capital markets there, that's one we got there. National currencies. We also had the question about China and Africa, investors' confidence in Africa, the debt cycle in Nigeria. By Jove, you'll be here all day. Can you manage all those? Just very, very quickly. Patrick, I think you might want to, and just closing remarks from the rest of you.
So maybe 30 seconds per economic issue. China, uncertainty, huge buildup of debt in China, China putting in place capital controls, trying to stabilize its currency. What is it going to mean for Africa? Our takeaway, China's interests in Africa are much more long-term and strategic, to be influenced by what we see as pretty short-term volatility. If you look at Chinese interests in Africa, the trade numbers have been impacted very much by the fall in commodity prices. But in volume terms, we are still seeing growth. We don't see this being disrupted by China's economic cycle necessarily, and I think this is an area that probably deserves a lot more attention. China is still going to be very significant for Africa. We don't see that changing anytime soon. Good question on how strongly are investors involved in sub-Saharan Africa despite the political volatility. I'm sure it won't be new news to anyone that there's a big difference in the views or perceptions of Africa risk depending on whether companies are already involved in the region or whether they're thinking of getting involved for the first time. Companies that have had a long-standing presence tend to ride out both the economic and political cycles. They tend to take a different view of these political risk factors, and it's very unlikely that you'll see many corporates pulling out simply because of short-term volatility. So yes, there's a perception that companies that have been operating in the region understand the politics a lot better, and we haven't necessarily seen those companies withdrawing in more turbulent times. There's any expectation that what we've seen in the recent past poses a big risk to that. Very good question on Nigeria's borrowing intentions, $30 billion for an economy that still depends on a single commodity for about 95% of its export receipts. Is it clever to do that? Some would say Nigeria has a very low, debt to GDP ratio with the rebasing of GDP. When you increase your denominator 89% in one go, maybe that creates a little bit of headroom for borrowing. But the real ratio to be looking at is what Nigeria manages to collect revenue mobilization, that has been around 7% of GDP, possibly even lower when you take out the oil. That doesn't create a great deal of space for very ambitious external borrowing. From that perspective, it's probably going to be risky to be looking at doing $30 billion all in one go. On the question related to domestic capital markets, this is where Nigeria can really come into its own. The strength of its demographics, the growing AUM, assets under management, of the domestic pension sector, even with the Naira devaluation, we're looking at an AUM of around $23 billion at least. That's going to be growing very significantly over time. Nigeria should be looking at its domestic resources and how to tap that to be able to finance the investment that's needed. Finally, the CFA franc question, a very good one. The Nigeria experience has maybe made a lot of us think about the difference between fixed and floating exchange rates. And what we realized very quickly in Nigeria's instance is that when you don't have that currency flexibility, you are in fact forcing the real economy of a country to adjust to any external shocks. That's not ideal. And this has long been recognized with the CFA franc zone. It's a good system in that it has delivered low inflation to franc zone economies, but that hasn't necessarily been synonymous with the most robust credit growth rates, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, where credit growth, private sector credit growth, really emerged as a differentiating factor in the growth prospects of African economies. This is when the Francophone economies generally lagged behind their Anglophone counterparts. So there'll be a lot more questioning about the ideal currency system and national currencies. But at the same time, we don't get the sense that any of the franc zone economies are about to walk away from this system. So the downsides are well known, but no one has made a decision to try to do things differently.
You know your economic onions, don't you, Razia? By Jove. Thank you, Razia. Patrick, there was one question to you. Akufo-Addo in Ghana, is he picking the right men and women for the cabinet?
Yeah.
And that's your final question.
Well, I think the process has started, of the formal appointments and so on, and then they're going to go through confirmation. The finance minister, Ken Ofori-Atta, I think, he's a banker, founded Data Bank, Pan-African Banking Group. Certainly put together, I was there last week, put together a really impressive group of Ghanaians from around the world, the diaspora banking groups around the world, flew into Accra, and they had a very high-level conference about putting a rescue program together to deal with the debt and to swoop. I think one of the themes that's been running through this evening about trying to get African economies away from dependence on commodities and into independent national production, processing, manufacturing, and part of this whole, African nationalism as opposed to Donald Trump nationalism, I think it's a very important theme. That is what Akufo-Addo is talking about. And some of the people he's got around him definitely believe that and want to try and put it into practice. I think we'll have to give them 6 months on that. But I think so far so good. Right. Foreign Minister looks good. Somebody asked a question about Sudan and South Sudan.
Oh yes, the security of South Sudan, no development,
That has got to be top of the agenda for Guterres at the UN and top of the agenda for the new leader of the African Union Commission. Most urgently of all, of course, South Sudan, you've got the food and medicine crisis and the need to get a serious force there, a neutral force, to ensure that you can't see a resumption of those targeted killings and the atrocities we've seen in the last two years. But again, they shouldn't then take their eye off what's happening in the northern neighbor, Sudan, where you've got you've seen a succession of street protests. 2 years ago, you saw horrendous massacres by the regime there. You saw a stay away back in December. If you talk to the regime, it was a complete failure. Everyone came to work. They've talked to the opposition. They were paying people to walk up and down the streets saying we're going to work. I think the political situation is deteriorating sharply there, and you're going to see an increasing confrontation. Of course, you've also got three guerrilla armies there confronting the regime. So you've got a lot for the AU. So it would be good to see political engagement there with a view to try to get open and credible elections in that country so you could see some political progress.
But you're
there.
right to highlight the humanitarian. I mean, Stephen O'Brien, the humanitarian chief at the United Nations, says 6 million, half of the population of South Sudan, is in dire need of humanitarian assistance. You know, 1 million children under the age of 5 at risk of malnutrition, 5 million food insecure, 3 million either displaced or refugees, 1 million refugees, 2 internally displaced, so 2 million internally displaced. And some people say, you know, perhaps 100,000 killed in the last 2 years, but certainly tens of thousands. So you're very right to highlight the dire situation in South Sudan. Thank you. So your closing remarks, please, very quickly, Chooks and Njoki.
Let me try and speak to your point about the gaping inequality in Africa. And this is really why, one of the reasons I'm really excited about green economy, because the green economy holds the prospect to actually address some of these inequalities. For example, through clean cook stoves, you know, agroforestry, rainwater harvesting, distributive energy, renewable energy system. We could actually begin to tackle this inequality through a lot of greening technologies and approaches. So inequality is one of the reasons why I'm actually very supportive of green economy. And then to the lady from the Lord, excellent points you made. I really appreciate all of those. So nothing much to add, apart from to, again, remind you that why access is an important challenge, why availability, access is an important challenge in Africa, availability is also still a challenge. So there are parts of lots of strategies, especially in the area of adaptation, that are still waiting to be funded by Africa. But also, the problem of access is exacerbated because of the problem of low capacity, which has to do with, again, finance. So there is a conundrum there, and I think that the West sometimes underappreciates the poor capacity in Africa to really access climate finance.
Thank you. And just the final word, because we're well over time. Thank you.
I actually did have something to say about the Trump Ebola kind of question. 2 things. One, that we saw also, remember the whole contingent of Kenyan healthcare practitioners that went over to Liberia to kind of help out with that. And so I think for me that is in a good way optimistic. We're going to see a lot more kind of regional collaborations and people just trying to work together a little better on the continent. I think that's a good thing. So in many ways, I think he'd move more to just kind of protect his people as much as possible, which is what anybody else would do. It's just that he has more money and more people, I guess. I don't know. I really dislike that man. With regard to the Africa Rising question, which I love this question so much. I think one of the things that we're going to have to do, we have to base our strategic decisions on data. There's so much data being collected about Africa on this continent that then goes to hide in university libraries and never comes back home. We never get a chance to read it. We never get a chance to engage with it. We never get a chance to critique it, to try to, you know, so stop hiding your thesis and your dissertations and all these beautiful things that you write in the University of Edinburgh and the University of London. Bring them home. Bring them home for us to see. Bring them home and so that we can measure our policies based on some of these things. We can. This is like digital development. It doesn't have to be done because you're at home on the soil of the continent. You can be helping from here. Let's be serious. That's number 1. Number 2, let's stop wasting women's time. Too many women are spending too much time fetching water and taking care of children instead of contributing to the national development agenda. So if we want Africa to rise, they really need to really hold up half of the sky as opposed to be watering. We're gonna really need to create cultural content that reminds people who have been deeply abused by bad governance how to dream. We've forgotten what it looks like to have Sankara. We've forgotten what it looks like to have good leaders. And so there's very many ways in which films have to be made, books need to be written, that kind of trample through the nonsense of the post-colony and the deep violence of poverty and of bad governance to tell us that things are possible. So we're definitely going to need that. We are going to need also to hijack the Pan-African agenda. When I see old names and old visions being kind of recycled for the rest of us to see, I think for Africa to rise, first of all, the AU agenda needs to move from being 2069 to closer. Like when you see that they're actually having a vision for 2069,
63.
like how, like what? So like literally they can just kind of hang out in the AU headquarters until then, you know, like it's crazy. It's crazy. So like somebody's going to need to come along and kind of hijack that. My last thing to say was about the changing of colonial currency. I think the thing that is most important is the changing of colonized mindsets. It's not even so much a currency. We can change the name of a currency, we can change the faces on notes, but we have to be able to change what people think, how people see themselves. Do they see themselves as free and dignified? What would that mean? I think we can even trade with the Queen on our paper if we can sleep and have water coming out of our taps. I don't even care anymore. We can use the pound again. If the thing is just the use of a currency, you know, but nobody can force me to pledge allegiance to Her Majesty. I can trade with her face.
Thank you very much, Njoki. That's it. Thank you very much indeed, especially to you and Njoki, because you've come all the way from Nairobi for these Africa prospects and forecasts. We're very grateful to you for taking all that time. Also to Chooks, Razia and Patrick, thank you to all of you for coming. It's wonderful to see so many friends of the Royal African Society and the staff members, of course, Richard Dowden, who leads the team, and council members, and also the team who put together, of course, this event for you. There is for the next hour in the Brunei suite upstairs. There'll be some drinks, so please do join us and circulate and talk to our panel if they are remaining some more. But it's been a great pleasure to be with all of you. I hope you've learned a great deal from this session, and good luck with all your particular endeavors for the rest of the year, and hope to see you at future RAS events. From me, thank you very much. Goodbye. Thank you.
I really want to watch.
You're in demand.